In this video, I'll show you 3 skirmish warbands that I built and painted, and talk about why I did them the way that I did, and a bit of the stories behind them. I love miniatures. I love painting them. I sometimes love building them, and I love creating stories with the figures that I collect and produce. And mostly, I love smaller forces, lower model count warbands for like skirmish game sets. I'm not really into like big army style games with tons of miniatures, all pretty much painted sort of the same. Sometimes there are exceptions, but mostly like the models I produce are for smaller skirmish games because then I can paint a few and then, move to a different project and a different paint scheme. It works pretty well for me. And honestly, it might work well for you too. If you find yourself hating the long trudge through a big army project, painting the same thing over and over again, then maybe it's time to hop onto that skirmish lifestyle and start enjoying smaller, shorter projects. Someone once said that variety is the spice of life, and at least in tabletop wargaming miniatures, I wholeheartedly agree. Lately, if I'm not painting terrain, then I'm painting small crews and warbands for all kinds of different skirmish games. Someone recently asked me somewhere, either social media or email or like a YouTube comment, I don't remember, but they asked me if I could show some of my finished skirmish warband projects and talk about like what goal I was reaching for, and what story I wanted to tell with them and, things like that. It was one of those like topic ideas that pretty much immediately got put into my phone in my, list of topic ideas, and then it kind of sat there, but when I'd finish a warband or, find one in a carrying case that I hadn't like looked in a while or whatever, I'd think, oh, there's another crew for that video idea. So now I'm gonna finally do it. The first warband I want to talk about is from OnePage Rules. They made a 2-player starter set called The Last Stand for their excellent sci-fi skirmish game, Grimdark Future Firefight. It included 5 models for their human defense force, which is kind of like the Imperial Guard from Warhammer 40K, and then also I think 5 or 6 cool space lizards, or splizzards as I like to call them. The set is available to buy, but not currently in the US due to all of the everything, but hopefully someday again soon. I really wanted to paint up the Human Defense Force models from this starter kit. Like I said, they have a bit of an Imperial Guard vibe to them, but they're scaled somewhere between the old kind of like heroic scale Imperial Guard with the stocky builds and the very thick wrists and ankles, and, between them and the new Cadian models, which I still love, I'll admit, but they're considerably more slight and, let's say, properly proportioned, especially when you put them next to like a Primaris Marine, for example. I'm glad that GW is finally getting the scale to follow the lore. This force of 5 models is pretty cool. I really love the sculpts. There are 3 grunts, for lack of a better word, although they're generally referred to as stormtroopers in Grimdark Future Firefight, and there's also 2 leader types. I've decided that the one with the cape and the beret is a company leader and the other is a veteran. The normal soldiers are smart enough to leave their helmets on, whereas the other 2, well, they seem unconcerned. Everybody seems very well kitted with their like combat knee pads and whatnot, and the models had very, very few mold lines. They're pretty great. Rather than doing like the standard military green paint job, right, I decided to try something very different from that. And I went to the other side of the color wheel where the red colors live. Maybe these forces are from some sort of red planet like Mars, or maybe they believe, like as a whole society, that camouflage is cowardice. So therefore they always keep their soldiers in red to be very, very visible. Either way, I just basically thought of like a modern military soldier where like most of their stuff is all kind of the same color. And then I did that here, but with red. I still did the boots and the guns mostly black, and I did a lot of silver armor, kind of scratchiness here and there, and then there's like detail on the figures, but otherwise I stayed mostly within the kind of the one color of red. I would use like layers of different dark washes in certain areas on the models to kind of change up the red into different tones, but it was a pretty efficient tabletop quality paint job. After I was mostly done with all of the uniforms and weapons, then I finally did the skin tones using different kind of colors so everybody wasn't, the same, and then did the bases in my normal sci-fi paint scheme. Pachow, and then they were done. Obviously, these are a perfect fit for Grimdark Future Firefight because, they were made for the game specifically. However, I've also statted them up for Space Weirdos, of course, which is one of my favorite skirmish games, and I could also easily use them in Space Station Zero. It's a game that, me and Vince, our company, Snarling Badger Studios, makes. They could be a very elite kind of spaceship crew, probably for a warship, of course. They're pretty standard models, honestly, and would work in tons of different sci-fi skirmish games out there. I wish my paint job was just like a little bit better, but I might just be kind of second-guessing myself as well. The next skirmish warband is just 4 weird kitbashes that I put together at VinceyCon, the tiny, very exclusive gaming convention held in Vince's basement every year, back in 2024. I love kitbashing, as I talked about in, last week's video, Pachow. And I like to build stuff rather than paint stuff when I'm at VinceyCon with, all of the award-winning Golden Demon painters there and stuff like that. These models are a mixture of Games Workshop, like old Imperial Guard, new Imperial Guard, some Genestealer cult stuff, some Adeptus Mechanicus stuff, and also parts from Stargrave and Wargames Atlantic as well. Sometimes the more parts you use can be a detriment to a kitbash, but when it works, it can really work. However, some of these figures are actually quite simple. This guy is pretty much just all Stargrave parts with like an Adeptus Mechanicus kind of robot head thing, and now he's a robot mercenary with a big gun and a drum mag. This guy has like Genestealer cult legs, Imperial Guard torso and arms, and a head from the cannon fodder set from Wargames Atlantic. Sometimes you don't need to do much more than glue parts together to get the look you're looking for. That said, some of these models did take a bit of cutting to make them fit together. Adding this AdMech torso and coat onto these Genestealer cult's legs took a good bit of cutting, mostly to the legs. It's better to cut a little and then test and see if it fits, and then cut again if needed, rather than to cut too much from the beginning and then have to like fill in and sculpt with green stuff or some other kind of putty, at least as far as I'm concerned. He's also got Stargrave arms and a Stargrave gun and a head from Puppets War that I thought looked pretty mysterious. I think it's best to have kind of a guiding idea when you start kitbashing together a warband. And I wanted a like totally mismatched crew of mercenaries or bounty hunters in this case. There's maybe a little bit of zealotry, usually space kind of guns for hire don't carry religious symbols or holy relics, but perhaps those skulls aren't relics, but are more like trophies. The great thing is that they can be both if you want. Our robot friend doesn't believe in all that mumbo jumbo, of course, and then, of course, the leader. Why is it that the one with the pistol and the sword always seems to be the leader? It's odd. I stayed very much in my comfort zone with the paint job on this crew. A lot of warm colors, a lot of browns, plenty of true metallics. That's kind of my thing. And then a unifying wash over the models when they're done. That seems to be the way that I paint lately. I wanted them grungy, but maybe not truly like grim dark and filthy, right? They still need to be able to go into civilization once in a while to get supplies and meet up with potential clients and collect bounties or whatever, right? I was pretty happy with the kind of subtle paint job. And again, I was focusing on tabletop quality. I like how they turned out. Lastly, the most recent Warband that I've finished, these are resin 3D printed models designed by Anvil Industry as part of their Anvil Digital Forge line of STLs. They're called Desert House Troopers, and I think that they're kind of inspired by the recent Dune movies a bit. There's parts in that set that make them look a lot more like the Sardaukar soldiers, in Dune, but I chose the parts, like heads and torsos mostly, that leaned more away from that look. I had my friend Dave from Bottle and Spool print them for me, link down in the description below, and then I started building them. They're very modular, like every model I've ever used from Anvil Industry, and they went together very easily, also like every model that I've ever used from Anvil Industry. These guys, I didn't want to kit bash or grunge up too much. I wanted them to be like faceless, literally, like faceless soldiers or security forces that could perhaps be like the bad guys in some games, either in like single player or co-op. I outfitted them all alike, even though there were plenty of choices, in the pack of STLs for all kinds of different weapons and other, add-ons and loadouts and all that kind of jazz. Once they were built, it was time to paint. I kind of stepped outside of my comfort zone in painting these models. I still primed them black, and I still used an airbrush zenithal over that black, but I used kind of a minty green airbrush zenithal over the top. I afterwards dry brushed everything to kind of pop the highlights a little bit, especially on the more kind of rigid armor plates. And then I used a dark wash on like the cloth parts to still keep them green, but to make them a darker version of that green. Initially, I planned on making their visors all silver, but when I painted them black first, for underpainting purposes, then I just kind of fell in love with that look. After they were painted completely, I sprayed them with a matte varnish and then brushed on a gloss varnish over like just their visor parts to really drive home the faceless, mysterious helmets. I kept them pretty much one overall color, which is what I usually do with organized military forces, and they were super quick to paint up. I mostly painted them on Twitch, actually, and I'm looking forward to them being kind of the Op 4 in an upcoming campaign. Maybe you'll see them in a battle report if I, get up the gumption to try and film one. So I hope that you enjoyed a bit of a dive into some of my skirmish warbands, how I did them, and why I did them like I did. If this video does well, then I can certainly do it again with other warbands in my collection. I definitely have more to talk about, like a lot more. Do you think a lot about your warbands and their stories and what kind of goes on behind the scenes of who they are? Or do you just kind of build and paint based on vibes? Let us all know down in the comments below. And please engage in some depressmentation of the like button. It really does help the channel, and it helps out the video, and it helps me as well. And while you're down there, if you're interested in seeing more videos like this every single Friday, you can hit the subscribe button. It's free. Thanks for watching.